Hello, my name is Cindy Wang. I'm a junior at Barrington High School, and my project is a particle and cell simulation of the Sunyaev-Zel'dovich effect. During this presentation, I'll first go over an introduction to my project, the purpose and hypothesis, a literature review, the materials and methods I used, the results, conclusion, and future work I want to pursue, acknowledgments, and my references. My project centers around the cosmic microwave background, or CMB. The CMB is remnant radiation from the Big Bang. The Big Bang, which occurred 380,000 years ago, was when the universe was extremely hot, dense, and filled with a plasma of photons, electrons, and nuclei. Because of this, a process called Thomson scattering was occurring simultaneously, and this meant that photons were unable to escape, which made the universe opaque at the time. However, then, as the universe began to expand and eventually cool, when it reached a temperature of 3000 Kelvin, a process called recombination started, which is when protons and electrons formed together to create neutral hydrogen atoms. This removed the excess electrons from the universe at the time and made the universe transparent, because then the photons could escape and eventually become what we now know as the CMB. The photons that escaped during this time period were initially with the gamma ray energies, but because of the expansion of the universe, those wavelengths also lengthened, and now they're in the microwave region, which is why it's called the cosmic microwave background. The cosmic microwave background is particularly unique because it's extremely isotropic and homogeneous, which means it's relatively the same at 2.7 Kelvin throughout the entire universe, even at completely opposite ends of it. This is particularly important because it means that even small deviations in the CMB are extremely important, as they're imprinted with the properties of dense environments, as these deviations only happen because of interactions with other charged particles that didn't happen at the beginning of the Big Bang. Because of this, scientists and astronomers have been studying the CMB ever since they discovered it, and this is done through various surveys and past CMB missions. The measurements of the CMB have followed four major categories. The first was when it was discovered accidentally in Bell Labs when Penzias and Wilson were looking at background signal noises. Then, the first major mission to investigate the CMB was with a microwave spectrometer, which recorded this first image on the very left on COBE. And then in 2001, WMAP, the Wilkinson microwave anisotropy probe, further improved measurements of the CMB in this middle photo. And then lastly, in 2013, the most recent and most refined version that we know of the CMB was the Planck probe, which refined our theories of dark matter distribution using the CMB and age of galaxy clusters. And this allowed scientists to be able to look even deeper into even smaller distortions within the CMB and get more accurate data. With all this data that we have, this underscores an even greater need for a better understanding of how CMB deviations directly translate to real-world manifestations, specifically in galaxy clusters and intergalactic medium. This means that ultimately I wanted to understand how specific parameters would vary the CMB. The main way that the CMB is varied and these deviations are created is through the Sunyaev-Zel'dovich effect. To understand the Sunyaev-Zel'dovich effect, we must first understand Compton scattering, which is an interaction between a photon and electron. The Compton scattering is when a high-energy photon interacts with a low-energy electron, but inverse Compton scattering is with a low-energy photon and a high-energy electron, and that is the Sunyaev-Zel'dovich effect. The Sunyaev-Zel'dovich effect is specifically within galaxy clusters and intergalactic medium, the interaction of electrons with photons through the inverse Compton scattering process. There are two main segments of the Sunyaev-Zel'dovich effect. First is the thermal, which I investigated in this research project, and this is when high-energy electrons interact with low-energy photons, and these electrons are high-energy due to temperature. On the other hand, the kinematic Sunyaev-Zel'dovich effect is when an electron or galaxy cluster is moving with a bulk velocity, and they're moving as a group. However, I chose to ignore the effects of the kinematic Sunyaev-Zel'dovich effect in this investigation because their effects are more than 10 times smaller compared to those of the thermal SZ effects, and thus are often ignored by astronomers when considering the Sunyaev-Zel'dovich effect. The purpose of my investigation was to simulate the SZ effect using a particle and cell simulation in order to determine predicted distortions in the photon energy and density due to Compton scattering in galaxy clusters and intergalactic medium. My hypotheses were three-pronged. First, I thought that particle and cell simulations can be used to adequately construct an accurate depiction of parameters in Compton and inverse Compton scattering. Next, as optical depth and thus the probability of interaction increases, the deviations from the initial energy distribution for photons would become more apparent. And then finally, as the temperature of electrons, which is the second parameter, is increased, while the optical depth is then held constant, the deviations from the initial distribution for the energy distributions of the photons from the initial blackbody CMB spectrum will increase proportionally. I examined previous work modeling the CMB and other charged particles with particle and cell simulations. Particle and cell simulations were first developed by Birdsall and Langdon in 1991. Particle and cell is particularly special because they macro bin particles in order to model billions or potentially even higher amounts of photons and electrons in the universe in a computationally efficient manner. They build them into larger macro particles that are still able to replicate the interactions that happen in real life and also put them into various cells that can then be distributed among CPU cores. Then photons and plasma interactions were investigated with Gladio et al. In 2020, and this allowed further discovery into how photons and plasma and other charged particles would interact in particle and cell simulations. And then finally, the code Tristan v2 was developed in 2024, which modeled and individually integrated charged particles and their trajectories, specifically with the Sunyaev-Zeldovich effect and inverse and Compton scattering. Then my methods to model the SZ effect were first to derive the physical equations needed, then to construct and benchmark the simulation I developed, initialize the experimental simulations to meet my research question, and then dive deeper into the optical depth and electron temperature experiments. First, I had to derive the physical equations in order to ensure that my simulation fit the actual real-life interactions between charged particles in the cosmic microwave background and intergalactic matter. So first, the Compton scattering interactions allow me to derive these two equations that are shown on the screen here with conservation of momentum and conservation of energy principles. And I also found that the change in energy largely was dependent on the scattering angle. Then I was able to use first principles in order to construct my simulation. And as you can see here is a depiction of what Compton scattering and the Sunyaev-Zeldovich effect may look like in a simulation. Then I had to construct and benchmark the simulation made to ensure that it fit the physical properties needed, and those physical properties and rules were translated over to the code. I used a particle and cell simulation as these are not only computationally efficient, but also was able to readily duplicate the exact physical processes that are happening in the universe right now. I knew that this had to cover both Compton and inverse Compton scattering, so I started with the code that I talked about briefly earlier, Tristan v2, which models Compton and inverse Compton scattering and the Sunyaev-Zeldovich effect. However, I had to make some modifications to this because it didn't exactly model what was going on in the cosmic microwave background itself. For example, I had to remove the radiation delay feature because this was something that doesn't occur in the CMB and actually wouldn't be helpful to model within the simulation. Then, based on the theoretical equation, I was able to track and benchmark the actual simulation, which you can see on the screen here, with the simulation of a photon hitting a static electron, which I'll talk a little bit more about in the results section. Then I had to initialize the simulation. The simulation was initialized with particles, specifically photons, on the left side of the simulation box that were traveling to the right with a given velocity. And this models exactly what happens in the cosmic microwave background. And to model intergalactic matter, the electrons were placed within a thin strip as seen on the screen in the middle of the simulation box. Then the electrons and the photons were initialized with the velocities and energies, as you can see on the right side of this graph here, with the top one being the photon energy distribution and the bottom one being the electron velocity distribution. The photons are initialized with a black body distribution, as this exactly models what the CMB is, which is a black body spectra. Then, to determine which parameters to use for my experiments, which were to compare optical depth and electron temperatures, I based this off of real-life CMB data and their averages. So, for example, the optical depth parameter was varied between 0.01 and 0.1, which represents a 1% to 10% probability of interaction between photons and electrons, and the actual value for the CMB that we know on average today is about 0.06 or 6% interaction. So this allows for a wide range of considerations, as this average of 6% is only within certain regions of the universe, and some regions are more dense and some regions less dense. So being able to range the optical depth parameter across a variety of different scopes allows us to look at not just an average of the universe, but also specific conditions. Additionally, the electron temperatures were ranged between 6 times 10 to the 6 Kelvin and 60 times 10 to the 6 Kelvin, which exactly parallel the same process that was developed in the optical depth parameters, as they directly mirror temperatures that the electrons would have in galaxy clusters and intergalactic medium. Finally, the materials that I used were my MacBook, and all the simulations were run on 8 CPU cores, which the simulation distributed the simulation across. And my coding was done in VS Code, which is a desktop app, and the code was transferred in its libraries to my laptop through Docker Desktop. Because of this, and the low computational power required, being able to run on just a MacBook, this makes and marks great leaps in potentially future astronomical simulations where hundreds of thousands of more particles will need to be simulated and a lot more computational power is needed. So being able to reduce the computational power for a simulation like this will be able to help advance astronomy in the future. My results were first the benchmarking test. So the benchmarking test was a simulation of photons that scattered off static electrons, as you can see on the screen here. Here, the static electron is in the center, and the color actually depicts the time that passed since the photon hits it. And here you can see on the right here is the energy change versus angle theoretical prediction line. And in the red line that you can see on the screen here is the theoretical prediction based on the derived equation that I showed earlier. And you can see that most of the photons actually fall on this line, which means that they are in line with the theoretical equation derived, and thus meet the physical principles that will actually govern the photon and electron interaction in real life. However, you can also see there are photons that do not fall on the line in the region surrounding on the graph. And the reason for this is because there's actually multiple scatterings happening. So as I said before, if a probability of interaction is 6%, the chance that multiple interactions will happen is significantly less than that, and it's pretty small. However, there's still a chance for it to occur, and in the simulation, it does occur. And that's what makes the photons fall down below or around the theoretical prediction line and not directly on it. And this is actually more of a depiction of real life, as in real life, multiple scatterings of a singular photon can also occur, while the equation simplistically only accounts for a single interaction, as that's how the simulation treats each interaction. So to sum up the first experiment, which was optical depth variation, the first thing that was discovered was that peak position on spectra was solely dependent on electron temperature and not varying optical depth. As you can see on the graph here, the peak position of each of these spectra lies around the same place, where here it's a bit more than 10 eV, and here is the second peak. Here you can see that no matter which optical depth is selected, all the peak positions are the same. And the physical reason behind this was found it is because the probability of interaction itself does not directly determine how much energy the change in photon is. So, for example, if a singular photon interacts with a low energy electron, with a greater probability, it will still gain the same amount of energy as if it interacted with a lower probability. So the probability is actually not a factor in determining the position of the peak along the energy spectra. However, it was also found that the optical depth and the probability of interaction affects the magnitude of the CMB deviations. So here you can see the 0.1 or 10% interaction curve, which is in green here, is a lot higher, and the deviations are a lot more magnified compared to that of, for example, the 0.01, which is the 1% interaction curve. And this is because as more photons are interacting with electrons, the deviations in energy will be greater. which also means that when looking at actual observational CMB data, it's important to see that greater deviations may mean that the electrons in the galaxy cluster that they're examining is more dense and the intergalactic medium is more dense. The electron temperature is set to 6 times 10 to the 7 Kelvin in this experiment, and the injected photon temperature is at 5,000 Kelvin. The optical depth was vary between 0.01 and 0.1. In the second experiment, the temperature of the electrons were varied, and it was found that the peak position varies linearly with electron temperature. So as you can see on the left here, this is the constant experiment, where the electron temperature was kept constant, and the optical depth was varied, and in this experiment, the peak position was the same. However, in the experiment, you can see on the right, the peak position changes, and it's roughly a change proportional to the temperature of the electron, as explained before. Additionally found in this experiment was that the distortions in the CMB photon energies were amplified proportional to the electron temperature. This means that higher energy electrons will result in greater distortions within the CMB, and thus can be manifested more clearly within the observational CMB data. Here you can see that, for example, when the electron temperature is at its highest at 60 times 10 to the 6 Kelvin, it is the peak of the green line is at the highest, and whereas the peak of the blue line, which is 6 times 10 to the 6 electron temperature in Kelvin, is the lowest. And it's roughly proportional to the electron temperature. So the deviation can be determined and can lead astronomers to find the electron temperature based solely on the distortions. This electron temperature was varied between 6 times 10 to the 6 Kelvin and 60 times 10 to the 6 Kelvin. The injected photon temperature was 5,000 Kelvin. The optical depth was 0.05 or 5%. Now, I looked back on my experiment and analyzed a couple errors in it. So the main error is that the photon energies was initially set at 5,000 Kelvin. However, as I said before, the CMB photons are actually only at 2.7 Kelvin. So what is the reason for this discrepancy? Well, the reason that it was set this way was because it actually improves the numerical accuracy of the simulation. When the simulation sets, when I found that the simulation is set to 2.7 for the photon energy, there's a lot of error because even a small deviation in the photon energy calculation can result in a large peak that is not actually a manifestation of physical interactions between photons and electrons, but rather just a computer simulation error or a floating point error. So by setting the photon energy a lot higher, it actually improves the numerical accuracy. Now, this, in turn, doesn't actually affect the accuracy of the results of our simulation that much. And the reason for this is because the photon temperature is still significantly less than the electron temperature, which is 6 times 10 to the 6 Kelvin to 60 times 10 to the 6 Kelvin. So as you can see, the photon energy is orders of magnitude less compared to the electron temperature. And in that way, it models the actual cosmic microwave background where the electrons are much more high energy compared to the photons. So the implications of this study is that it solidifies the importance of past observational missions such as WMAP, COPE, and Planck, and leads to future work that can be done in order to use the data from these observational missions in order to learn more about our universe. For example, being able to determine how the optical depth correlates with distortions in the CMB can help astronomers find out the galaxy cluster density distribution and mass distributions, as these both correlate with the optical depth. Additionally, because the electron temperature correlates with the distortions of the CMB proportionally, we can also look at cluster temperature constraints in order with the CMB data and use it as another way and an even easier way to gather more information about the universe. One other implication is that the Synoev-Zeldovich effect is uniquely independent of redshift, which is very important compared to other astronomical factors, which often aren't. This allows the Synoev-Zeldovich effect to poise itself perfectly to be a benchmark in the dark matter distribution hunt, where scientists can use things like the optical depth, which is proportional to the CMB distortion, to be able to determine the density of dark matter within galaxies and constrain parameters like the Hubble constant. The CMB is also a direct manifestation of the formation of the universe and has been moving with the expansion of the universe, which means that it is investigating the distortions in it are very important in understanding why exactly it formed, how it formed in the very first minutes of the universe. Future work that can be done is modeling the kinematic Synoev-Zeldovich effect. As I mentioned earlier, this effect is 10 times smaller or more compared to the thermal Sunyaev-Zel'dovich effect, which is why it wasn't modeled in this simulation. However, it might still have an effect, and distortions caused by the kinematic effect might lead to different or new conclusions. So modeling it would be a natural next step in this investigation. Another one is to model the effects of magnetic fields and plasma turbulence, which will be apparent with actual observational CMB data. A final one is to extend this to observational CMB data and see how it correlates with actual galaxy clusters and intergalactic medium measurements. To conclude, this experiment used particle and cell simulations to model the cosmic microwave background, and specifically the effects of the Sunyaev-Zel'dovich effect, which is inverse Compton scattering. I found that electron temperature linearly affects the peak position of the photon spectra, and additionally, the CMB distortions are proportional to the temperature and optical depth set. Important direct applications of the study are that they can be used to constrain dark matter and energy parameters, as, for example, the optical depth, which is proportional to CMB distortions, can be used to very easily find matter and density distributions within galaxies and further determine potential dark matter or energy considerations. Additionally, it can be used to examine mass distribution in galaxy clusters, especially with the optical depth, in order to help astronomers better determine even far-away galaxies with the measurement of the CMB. And finally, it can be used to understand the formation and expansion of the universe, as ultimately the CMB is a reflection of the very early days of the universe, and better understanding the distortions that have led us to be able to observe what we do today will be able to help us further understand exactly how it formed and the very first minutes of our universe. I would like to thank my parents for supporting me and my sponsor, Dr. Baylor. And here are my image references, my paper references, and thank you.